Bienvenidos y bienvenidas y sobre todo gracias por acompañarnos a esta Masterclass de título Contaminación atmosférica y salud en el entorno urbano. Es la tercera y la última de lo que ha abarcado el webinario Resiliencia urbana ante los retos futuros. Para quienes no estén familiarizados, LAIF City Life es una iniciativa que trabaja para transformar las ciudades de América Latina mediante proyectos de regeneración urbana. Nuestro objetivo es fomentar la colaboración entre gobiernos locales, sociedad civil y actores internacionales. Y lo hacemos para implementar soluciones innovadoras, sobre todo innovadoras que mejoren la calidad de las personas a través de un urbanismo que respete el medio ambiente. Y hoy, para reforzar esta idea y esta misión, tenemos el placer de contar con Joana Ferreira, ingeniera ambiental y doctora en Ciencias Ambientales Aplicadas por la Universidade de Aveiro. Es también investigadora asistente en el Departamento de Medio Ambiente y Planificación de la misma universidad y desde 2001 forma parte de dos grupos, el grupo de investigación de modelización de emisiones y cambio climático y del Centro de Estudios Ambientales y Marinos. Su trabajo de investigación se centra en inventarios y escenarios de emisiones, modelización y gestión de la calidad del aire y en evaluación de la exposición humana y el impacto en la salud. Joana lleva publicados alrededor de más de 100 artículos y comunicaciones científicas. En el marco de este webinario de LAIF City Life, Resiliencia urbana ante los retos futuros, que se ha realizado en colaboración con la Universidad de Aveiro, se han diseñado 3 sesiones o masterclass y en esta última sesión de hoy, Joana abordará un desafío cada vez más urgente para nuestras ciudades, que es la contaminación del aire y su impacto directo en la salud de las personas. Porque muchas veces hablamos de cambio climático desde una escala global, pero sus efectos también se perciben en algo tan cotidiano como es el aire que respiramos. A través de esta sesión vamos a conocer cómo las políticas coordinadas en materia de clima, calidad de aire y salud pueden generar beneficios concretos y rápidos para la población. Así que esperamos que os resulte interesante y provechosa esta próxima hora con Joana. Y simplemente un último paréntesis, recuerdo que la sesión va a ser en inglés y las instrucciones para la transcripción al idioma elegido están en el chat. Gracias nuevamente por estar aquí y sin más cedo la palabra a la ponente, cuando quieras.
You also have heard that air pollution affects well-being, and 92% of people living in cities do not breathe safe air. And this is why air pollution is important, and this is why we care about air pollution and we study air pollution. This is often called the invisible killer because we don't see the air pollution. It is not visible, but it can be deadly. So we have sources of air pollution in the earth, and more specifically in the urban environment. And these sources can be classified as natural, resulting from biological and natural activity. For example, dust transport from North Africa that usually affects the South Europe, Portugal, Spain, Italy, the Mediterranean area. We also have emissions from vegetation, animals, forest fires, volcanoes, oceans. But mainly we are interested because that's where we can act on anthropogenic emissions, the ones that result from human activities. Then you have air pollutants, and these air pollutants can be directly emitted from these sources or can be formed in the atmosphere as a result of the transformation of primary pollutants. For example, ozone, that you may have heard about, ozone in the troposphere, ozone at our life level, at our breathing level. Ozone is an air pollutant, and it's formed by other pollutants that are emitted and react in the atmosphere. Some important pollutants in terms of the health effects are not only the gaseous pollutants, but also the particulate pollutants. And if you look at this picture and you see this gray feature that represents air, human air, or this yellow picture that represents sand, a grain of sand. Particles are much smaller than these two images. They are represented here as PM10, particulate matter with an equivalent aerodynamic diameter of 10 micrometers, and even smaller, we have PM2.5 that correspond in average to a diameter of 2.5 micrometers. And then we have the gases, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, methane, volatile organic compounds, among others. I'm focusing on the ones more important on urban environment. So as I said, we have these natural sources and anthropogenic sources. And on the anthropogenic sources, we include all means of transport. We include industries, like the stacks emitting pollutants into the atmosphere. We include waste treatment, all the cleaning products that we use in cleaning and washing, among other activities. Agriculture activities, livestock activities, all these are anthropogenic sources of air pollution. Once the pollutants are in the air, released into the air, they suffer what we call dispersion and transport. And this is due to the meteorological conditions, wind speed, wind direction, humidity, air pressure, among other meteorological parameters. And they are transported across different areas. Depending on the pollutant, they can travel far, as I mentioned, the North African dust that reaches Europe, or they can have short lives and be quickly transformed into other pollutants. So they suffer chemical reactions. And the output of all these processes determines air quality and deposition. Some pollutants can deposit on the soil, in the oceans, in all Earth's surfaces. So air quality is the condition of the air in terms of its composition, cleanliness, and the presence of pollutants or contaminants. It's a measure of the overall healthiness of the air that we breathe. And if you look at those two pictures so I said that air pollution is invisible, usually it is, but there are situations where we can see the effect of air pollution, for example, because it reduces our visibility. And that's what is shown in the bottom figure of the same place of this one. We have to control air pollution, we have regulation, we have policy. And why do we need to control? Because of its harmful effects on our health and on the environment. In Europe, we have directives, so regulated documents produced by the European Commission. And for air quality, we have a brand new air quality directive that was a revision of a previous one, but it has more strict standards to fulfill and more pollutants covered. And I'll go into that in more detail later on. And worldwide, we cannot call this policy, but the World Health Organization sets guidelines for air quality to protect human health. And the previous air quality directive that I was talking about is very much aligned with the goals of WHO guidelines, which are much more strict than they were in the past. They have current levels until 2030, then some interim targets, and even more strict levels for later. So we have to manage air quality, we have to reduce the impacts of air quality, and we have three main tools to manage air quality. We can act in terms of the source. We can reduce sources, reduce the emissions from the sources. And for that, we use emission inventories. If you think of the definition of an inventory of a house, for example, it's a full list of all items and characteristics of those items that you have inside your house. We also have emission inventories in the same way. All types of activities that emit pollutants into the atmosphere, which pollutants, in what amounts, and for which areas. Another tool to manage air quality is the monitoring, and a third one is the modeling. Regarding monitoring, we have regulation for air quality monitoring. And in Europe, and the Air Quality Directive sets some monitoring criteria to have continuous monitoring of specific pollutants. And this monitoring criteria depends on the location, number of sampling points, and the methods used in this monitoring. We should cover traffic, industrial, and background influence on air quality, and type of environment, urban, suburban, and rural. And these, we try to, according to the legislation, the government is forced to install these fixed air quality monitoring stations to monitor air quality in specific locations. And apart from that, we also have, because we cannot have fixed air quality stations everywhere, so we could complement these measurements with, for example, mobile labs or low-cost microsensors. Very popular these days because they are cheap and easy to use. Then we have modeling. And why do we use models? And in my research, I do air quality management based on modeling. Why do we use models? Because it's impossible to measure air pollution everywhere. We use it to simulate the dispersion of air pollutants away of their emission sources, to estimate ground level pollution concentrations, and to estimate and to assess the feasibility and the effectiveness of emission control strategies. So and I'll give you some examples on this later on. If we want to implement a strategy, but we are not sure if it will be effective or not, we can model it. We can simulate what will be the impact of a certain strategy. We can also predict the effect of a new emission source, and similarly to what we have for the meteorological forecast. So we know that tomorrow, we have a forecast if tomorrow it will be raining or the temperature will be high or low. The same we have for air quality. And this could prevent, for example, more vulnerable groups to suffer the impacts of a poor air quality. Moving on, we have these models. They tend to reproduce what happens in the real case. This change from emissions to transport dispersion, chemical reactions, air quality and deposition. So the air quality model simulates this real case behavior. And for that, it needs input data like the emissions, meteorological conditions, topography, land use. And the model itself should have numerical methods to simulate the physical processes and the chemical transformations. The output will be concentrations of air pollutants in 3D, so in surface and also in altitude. So in the end, an air quality model can simulate, depending on its complexity, it can simulate all these complex processes that occur in the atmosphere and are more or less represented in this scheme. I will not go into detail. This is just to show you how complex this is. And we have different types of models depending on the purpose of our assessment. We have physical models, wind tunnel simulation, and we have mathematical models, deterministic or statistical. And these models are suitable for different scales of application. The spatial scale could be from global, regional to local and micro scale. The time scale is a bit related to the spatial scale, from long-term to seasonal or short-term. And in terms of the dispersion of pollutants, the model can consider chemical reactions or consider the pollutants as passive compounds, so it only simulates its dispersion. This is an example of a real case, and this is in Macau, an automatic region in China. And in Macau city center, there is a road that is called Rua do Campo, where an air quality station is located, and it registers high levels of air pollution. And we wanted to understand what was driving this air pollution, and if it is something located, a hotspot, very associated to that street, or if it could be a more general problem. So we used the cascade of different models, starting by a regional scale model covering all big area centered in Macau, then a more urban contribution where we see some hotspots already, and then a local contribution. And in the local contribution, we clearly see that road as high concentrations of PM 2.5. And with this, we can why? Because traffic is the most important contribution source. And with this, if we can apply this, there were some strategies tested. If we can apply some strategies to mobility, we can improve the levels of air pollution in this area and contribute to reduce the impacts on human health. Then, effects of air pollution on health. From statistical data indicates that every year we have 7 million premature deaths due to air pollution. And this includes not only outdoor air, but also indoor poor air quality. And the type of effects range from skin aging, high irritation, cardiovascular and respiratory diseases that could lead in the end to death. Approximately 91% of the global population breathes air in which the concentrations of air pollution exceed the World Health Organization recommendations. So the studies have shown, as I said, effects on cardiovascular disease, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, lung development in children, and cancer. And there's strong evidence that air pollution could lead to brain development in children, could be associated with brain development, with dementia, and type 2 diabetes. Maybe if I would ask you, what do you think is the most important cause of death in the world, and the second biggest case, maybe you'd not say that air pollution is the second biggest cause of premature deaths worldwide. But it is. And it is the second leading risk factor for early death. And so high blood pressure is the first one. So that's attributable to air pollution in 2023, 7.9 million deaths, about 1 in 8 deaths worldwide. Of this total, around 5 million were attributed to PM 2.5 exposure and 2.8 million from household air pollution. So in the world, this map shows the number of deaths distributed in the world. I know, as you can see, the worst region is in Asia, India, and China, but we have also other regions in the world, including Latin America, that are, that have a high number of premature deaths due to air pollution. More data. If we look into the most polluted capital cities and the most polluted cities in the world, you can easily see that the top 3 to 5 cities are located in India. And this is because, as you may know, in India is where you have highest population density and highest air pollution. So it's a combination of both, because if you have, as I will mention in a while, if you have high concentrations of air pollutants, but you have no one there, living there, there's no impacts on health. And talking about that, we usually treat these health effects of air pollution as a chain of events, from emission sources until health effects. And it's important to see this difference between air quality and exposure. Air quality, as I said, is a characteristic of the atmosphere, depending on the time and location. But exposure already means an interaction between an air pollutant and an individual in a specific environment. So the same air quality may lead to different levels of exposure. And even if we are all together in the same place, breathing the same quality of air, we could be affected differently. And this is because of the dose. This is because of the pollutant intake through our physical barriers, like the skin, ingestion, inhalation. And so this means that health effects can be dependent on a series of factors. For example, the duration and frequency of the exposure, the toxicity of the pollutant, the global health state of the person, and the resistance or susceptibility level. Effects of air pollution on health can be of short term, and this would lead to acute effects, for example, eyes irritation or breathing difficulties, or long-term exposure would lead to chronic effects, respiratory or nervous systems destruction, effects on reproduction, and among others. Going back to this chain of events, how can we estimate this exposure? This can be estimated using ambient concentrations as a proxy. So we know, or we measure, or we model air quality concentrations, and based on that, we estimate our exposure by what we call a population-weighted concentration. And this is an example that was performed in scope of an European project for our region, for Aveiro region. And we have the population distribution, the PM 2.5 distribution. So warmer colors mean higher concentrations. You clearly see here some road networks, here some hotspots of industry north of the city. And if we cross these two, we have the population that is potentially exposed to concentrations, for example, above the limit value imposed by legislation, which for PM2.5 is still 25. But this will be updated with this new air quality directive. But this could give us an idea of the potentially exposed population, but this has a limitation. And what do you think would be the limitation? You can already think about that, and this relates to our daily activities. If you think of your daily activity, you maybe easily think that you spend most of your time indoors. And so if we are outdoor, we are exposed to certain pollution. But if you are indoor, there are different sources of air pollution that could affect your health. So, and by indoors, I mean work location, residence location, leisure activities locations that are almost all of them indoors. Transports, public transports, bus, underground, you are always indoors. If you think of your daily routines, I think you will easily reach this conclusion. So it's important to include this factor when estimating exposure. And so we can have a more robust approach for human exposure estimation. And we can actually measure individual exposure based on these devices, portable devices that can be wearables. Or if we don't have this option, we can model. And how do we model? We think of the different locations where we spend a given time along our day, and we can estimate or measure the concentrations of pollutants in these different locations and do weighted sum of these concentration times the time that you spend in each one of these microenvironments, as we call them. And so these studies of human exposure can be oriented to the general population or to some vulnerable groups, like, for example, children, industrial workers, firefighters. In fact, in some cases, these are elderly people. And we have different methodologies, the population exposure assessment and the individual exposure assessment. I'll give you some quick examples on these two different approaches. This is an estimation of human exposure, population exposure in the second biggest city of Portugal, Porto. We consider the concentration simulated by a model in order to get this pattern, spatial pattern, that is difficult to attain with only measurements, so we use models. Then we account for the distribution of the population during the day and during the night. During the night, you see they mostly go home and they live in the outskirts of the city. This is the city center. We account for what we call the time activity patterns. So how much time they spend in which type of environment, indoor or outdoor. And we estimate exposure. And if we compare this population exposure, the right side figure, with the one on the left, which is the concentrations, you clearly see that concentrations are higher in the urban area, and decrease with the radius distance to the city. But in terms of exposure, this pattern also exists, but with lower levels. Because in average, PM10 could be lower, much lower in indoor environments than outdoors, depending on where you live and depending on your heating appliances. Another example for a children risk group, and this was hypothetical study performed in Aveiro city center, and choosing the path to school. This is an avenue with two schools. One of these is inside this green circle, and we assume different children living in different areas of this red rectangle and their ways to the school. And we had different paths, A, B, C, and D, different ways of reaching the school. And we estimated air pollution, the human exposure, and we concluded that the path C would lead to the higher exposure, the higher exposure. So this is a hypothetical study, but can easily be translated into real world. So the message is that children or everyone could select their way to their work, to their school, to avoid or reduce impacts of air pollution, and basically avoiding heavy traffic streets. In terms of health effects, and how can we reach these 7 million, 8 million premature deaths annually? How can we estimate this value? We can do this using what we call concentration response functions and performing an health impact assessment. So these are no more than mathematical functions that have been derived from epidemiological studies from several countries around the world that relate the levels of exposure with the increased risk of death or disability. These dose-response relationships vary with the pollutant, with the individual sensitivity, and the type of effect on health. Just for your information, there is the World Health Organization provides a tool to calculate these health effects of air pollution based on this type of concentration response functions. And this methodology relies on population data and concentrations of air pollutants and relative risk functions and incidence or prevalence rate of certain disease or risk of premature deaths. I will not go into details on this. Just to tell you that these relative risks vary a lot and have a high degree of uncertainty. So when we say that there are 7 million deaths annually, this could be 7 or 6 or 9, but at least is a magnitude of a value. And this allows scientists and decision makers to take action. The uncertainty is high, but this gives us a level of magnitude. And this, we express this risk as total number of premature deaths, but also if we only focus on disease, we can also have other types of indicators. For example, years lived with a disability. For example, if someone has life expectancy of 8 years old, but he gets sick and he has a disease at 60 years old, this means that he will live with this disability. And this parameter can be estimated as well. Then I'll show you a practical example on how to reduce air pollution and its health effects based on emission reduction strategies. And for that, we use an integrated assessment approach, starting from emissions as well, going through air quality, human exposure, health impacts, and more importantly, for stakeholders, for decision makers, economic evaluation of these costs. So, how do we do this economical evaluation? If we plan a strategy to reduce air pollution, and this will imply that we'll improve health, we'll reduce the health impacts of air pollution. So we will have a health benefit. And this can be also seen as an avoided cost. If someone has a disease, the government and the person itself, they spend money trying to, with medical assistance, with treatments, with so on. If we avoid that disease to happen, we are saving money. And that's what we call this benefit, this avoided cost. And this can be estimated, is again an estimation. And there are, we need a lot of data that we don't have, or a lot of country-based data that we don't have. So we have to rely on most European-wide data in terms of Europe and maybe elsewhere in the world. And we rely on what we call the value of statistical life, that accounts for the willingness to pay, healthcare costs, and net loss of protection. And we multiply this individual cost by case, depending on the health endpoint, by the number of cases of, for example, a specific disease or a premature death. So, an example, from emissions to air quality. Let's start from the beginning. We always need a measure, a strategy that we want to study. And this we call a reduction scenario. And we have to compare that with a reference scenario. And then from these scenarios to a cost-benefit analysis, we should compare this external cost, and this is the avoided cost, the benefit in terms of monetary value, and we should compare this by the cost of implementing the strategy that we are studying. Let's give an example. For Porto, again, for the second biggest city in Portugal, we have tested this measure of reconverting fireplaces. We used a lot of fireplaces in our houses in winter. So we burn wood to get heating in the houses. And if we reconvert these fireplaces to more efficient wood stoves, we can reduce PM10 emissions. So we simulated the reconversion of 50% of the fireplaces. And another measure that we, this is not recent, this was done some years ago. And we had a measure on transport. And we assumed a replacement of fuel and diesel light vehicles by hybrid vehicles. And this led to the reduction of PM10 emissions and reduction of NOx emissions. Then we tested these emissions into an air quality model. And these maps show the difference in terms of concentration with these two measures, the hybrid vehicles and the fireplaces converted, the difference in terms of concentration between the reduction scenario and the reference. And what we see is that we can have reductions of mainly PM10 and also of NO2 annual mean concentrations. Then going further to the health impacts and to the benefits, to the avoided cost. And these maps show the avoided costs related to PM10, the ones related to NO2, and the total. And what we concluded is that in total, we have a benefit of 3.1 million euros per year, and the highest contribution comes from PM10 levels. Then we compare this benefit with the internal cost. So how much would cost the implementation of this measure? And this was estimated, roughly estimated, by 2.8 million. So we have a positive balance of 0.3 million euros per year. So we have a net benefit. We have a positive net benefit. So this means that we need to invest a lot to implement such kind of measures, but what we get as a result is a benefit. Okay? Moving down now to a study that relates climate change effects and air pollution. there was an European project that aimed to develop action strategies for climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, but looking into this as an holistic approach and multi-scale approach, including emissions, air quality, agriculture, health and well-being, energy, water, biodiversity, forestry, transport, and urban planning. And the project aimed and succeeded in building a decision support system to help policymakers to take action and to take the most out of the knowledge, tools, and recommendations generated by this project. So the methodology is complex, and we were at the University of Aveiro responsible for the emissions and air quality and health impacts. This adds a very strong component of co-creation, which means we involved stakeholders, municipalities, case studies in the definition of these strategies. And we evaluated effects of climate change only, effects of climate change and socio-economical changes in the future, and also mitigation and adaptation strategies proposed by the case studies, by the stakeholders of the case studies. And we have evaluated all these structures, all these strategies, in covering the different sectors that I told you about. I will only show you the examples for emissions, air quality, and health. And these were evaluated by two different indicators. One was the reduction of air quality impacts on human health, and another one, the reduction of excess mortality due to heat. And we classified these indicators according to their potential impacts, the potential impacts of the strategies on these indicators. High negative impact to a high positive impact, where 3, from 1 to 5, where 3 meant no effect. We use an equality model. We use these concentration response functions to estimate meteorological and air quality impacts on health in terms of mortality and morbidity, so diseases, cases of disease. And I'll give you here an example for the municipality of Torino in Italy. And the strategies were very much focused on reducing the impact of heat waves, increasing the quantity and accessibility of refuge areas from urban heat, increase of urban greenery on roofs, in parks and in gardens, increase green areas and ecological connections between them. And these green infrastructure were mostly addressed by my colleague Bruno in the previous masterclass. And in the end, so we know that they could have a positive impact in terms of protecting us from heat, but in terms of air quality, they can either have a positive or negative impact. Other emission reduction strategies were focused on mobility, so provide an efficient and integrated network of public services, reduce the demand in the transport sector by promoting campaigns and nudging policies towards sustainable mobility. So these strategies were evaluated And for the future, in 2050, compared to 2018, which was the base year, we estimated that premature deaths due to PM 2.5 could be reduced by 28%, and premature deaths due to NO2 could be reduced 45%. All these strategies and all the scores that we gave for the different indicators, there were 26 different indicators covering the different sectors, were fed into this decision support tool that is freely available in the web if you want to explore those and maybe apply those to your cases. It's the standard DSS tool. To finish, I'll give you an example of an even more robust approach to estimate the health effects of air quality in urban areas using an epidemiological approach. This is an ongoing project, so I will not show you results. The case study is, again, municipalities of around the Porto city. And we intend to use monitoring, modeling, and an epidemiological study focusing precisely on clinical data that is not always accessible, but in this project we will be able to access this clinical data and build some more robust study on these health impacts of air pollution. And another challenge that this project includes is addressing emerging pollutants like ultrafine particles and black carbon. And in Europe, these pollutants are already addressed by the new legislation for air quality. So in the upcoming months, years, until 2030, we have to have continuous measurements of this type of pollutants. And we hope to end this project with some more insights on the effects of air pollution on health in Portugal, more specifically in this urban area of Porto. So I'll finish giving you some ways to reduce air pollution, some ways for individual action, things that we can do in our daily lives. We can choose walking or cycling instead of taking our individual car. We can commute to our work, so do some carpooling to go to work. We could try to use more or apply more renewable energy sources. We can try to avoid burning wood, and have some more actions also inside our homes, so to protect our health against air pollution. And with this, I conclude, and I thank you all for your interest, and happy to answer to some questions if you have.
Well, thank you very much, Joana. I think it's been a very interesting hour. I know we are very close to the end, so I'm going to go straight to the question, if you don't mind. Simplemente quería comentar que, bueno, ha sido una hora creo que bastante interesante. Esta Masterclass ha sido una excelente oportunidad para entender y reflexionar sobre cómo y hasta qué punto un entorno urbano no sostenible afecta al humano, a nosotros, y conocer también herramientas de ejemplos que nos permiten actuar, ¿no? To take action, para
Ujú.
conseguir revertir este tipo de entornos con esas estrategias de reducción de emisiones que nos has explicado. Pues te agradezco muchísimo el tiempo y en este caso la exposición que has hecho sobre ello. Em, Tengo, bueno, aquí vamos a ir directamente. La pregunta sería, una de ellas es, ¿cuáles son las principales leyes y regulaciones relacionadas con la contaminación del aire?
Eso depende muchísimo dónde estamos, de qué país hablamos. En Europa, nosotros tenemos que fijarnos en las reglas de la Comunidad Europea, las directivas, que son siempre transponibles al derecho interno de Portugal. Am, eh, Eso es por lo que tenemos que cumplir.
Ujú, ujú,
En otros países, por ejemplo, en Estados Unidos tenemos EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, que también tienen estándares, valores límite para poluentes atmosféricos. Uh, en otros países, algunos tienen regulación, otros no. Pero todos tenemos esas recomendaciones de la Organización Mundial de Salud, que son precisamente para prevenir los impactos en la salud. Son muy difíciles de cumplir, sí, ah, pero es, es para garantizar que no tendremos problemas con la salud. Sí.
Pues muchas gracias. Vamos a la segunda pregunta y con esto cerraremos. Y está dirigida a conocer qué equipos o aplicaciones simples, sencillas existen para medir y monitorear la calidad del aire en entornos urbanos.
Ujú. Como he enseñado, ahora los equipos más simples son los microsensores, pero hay que tener algún cuidado, hay que saber lo que estamos usando. No basta con me compro uno, le pongo afuera y ya está. No, porque hay microsensores de diferentes precios y de diferente calidad, se puede decir. Algunos tienen mucha incertidumbre en los valores y son más baratos. Entonces, hay un compromiso entre el precio y la fiabilidad. Otra cosa que es muy popular ahora es que tiene dos objetivos, que es de sensibilizar la población y envolviéndola en las mediciones. Y hay varios proyectos, varias plataformas de sensores que uno compra, pone en su casa, en su window, ventana, en su
Ventana.
ventana, la parte de fuera, y mide determinados poluentes, y eso es directamente introducido en la plataforma automáticamente. Entonces, puedes ver un mapa del mundo con los puntos donde están los sensores personales. Eso es una forma de la propia persona saber qué poluentes y si hay peligro o no, si son concentraciones elevadas o no, y también para los investigadores, los decisores políticos, saber cuáles son las zonas donde puede haber problemas. Porque cuando no es posible tener esos equipos fijos por toda parte. Es muy caro, muy dispendioso. Entonces, esa es una forma puede no ser un valor muy justo, muy cierto, pero te da una idea de la magnitud del valor. Sí. Y sur- principalmente puedes comparar entre diferentes zonas. Eso es muy interesante porque para personas sensibles, para grupos de riesgo, puedes tener más información sobre los peligros de la polución atmosférica para tu salud.
Pues sí, la verdad es que yo no lo conocía y me parece bastante interesante tener esa idea, bueno,
Ujú.
aproximada, aunque no sea lo que tú decías. No tenía idea. Pues muchas gracias por también respondernos con tantísima información a las preguntas. Em, Vamos a cerrar porque ya nos salimos del tiempo. Quería agradecer la generosidad ofrecida a Joana por participar en el espacio, por compartir tiempo y conocimiento con todos nosotros. Ha sido un placer.
Para mí también. Muchas gracias.
También aprovecho y quería agradecer de nuevo a los participantes que han asistido y nos han acompañado en esta poco más de una hora de masterclass que quedará grabada y la compartiremos en nuestra página web de lifecitylife.aecid.es. Y por último, y antes de despedirme, solo recordar que hacemos un parón en esta edición de formación de Life City Life 2026. Volveremos en septiembre con el webinario de tecnologías aplicadas en ciudades inteligentes, gestión urbana basada en datos, ese es el título. Se lo van a realizar hasta 3 ponentes de la Universidad de Ciencias Aplicadas de Zúrich. Y bueno, podéis encontrar ya, está disponible esa información y también podéis registraros en la sección de comunicación de nuestra web. Ahí hay un artículo sobre estos webinarios y bueno, también estaremos siguiendo publicando más en redes sociales, tanto de LinkedIn como en Instagram. Así que os esperamos. Muchas gracias de nuevo a todos y hasta la próxima.
Hasta la próxima. Muchas gracias.